What's up, babies? It's big day. 9th of Savannah, 5786, Monday, May 25th. Fuck, what's the date is? No one really knows for sure. Aluvei Elo, Divrei Elohim, Chaim, but this is the majority of why. (3761) creation of the world, birth of Adam and Eve, 3631, 137, son of Adam, born 35, 26, 235, Enosh, son of Seth, was born 34, 36, 325, Kenan, son of Enosh, was born 3366, 395, Mahalalel, son of Kenan, was born 3301, 460, Yered, son of Mahalalel, was born 3122, Hanak, son of Yered, was born. Cool, think about going cool if you. Oh shit, today's 150 days. Shit. Alright. I mean, that's good. Methuselah, son of Hanak, was born. Those Jews, bitch again. 3761 creation of the world, birth of Adam and Eve, Chava, 3631, 137, son of Adam, was born 3526, 235, Enosh, son of Seth, was born 3436, 325, Kenan, son of Enosh, was born 3366, 395, Mahalalel, son of Kenan, was born 3301, 460, Yered, son of Mahalalel, was born 3139, 622, Hanak, son of Yered, was born 3074, 687, Methuselah, son of Hanak, was born. 969 years, baby. Everybody knows that.
Creation of heaven and earth. Secular year Jewish year event in history. Minus 3761 creation of the world. Birth of Adam and Eve, Shabbat. Minus 3631 137, son of Adam, was born. Minus 3526 235 Enosh, son of Seth, was born. Minus 3436 325 Kenan, son of Enosh, was born. Minus 3366 395 Mahalalel, son of Kenan, was born. Minus 3301 460 Yered, son of Mahalalel, was born. Minus 3139 622 Chanak, son of Yered, was born. Minus 3074 687 Methuselah, son of Chanak, was born. Minus 2887 874 Lamech II, son of Methuselah, was born. Minus 2831 930 Adam died. Minus 2705 1056 Noah, son of Lamech II, was born. Minus 2225 1536 Noah began the construction of the ark. Minus 2205 1556 Japheth, son of Noah, was born. Minus 2204 1557 Cham, son of Noah, was born. Minus 2203 1558 Shem, son of Noah, was born. Minus 2105 1656 Metushelach died. Minus 2105 1656 The great flood covered the earth. Minus 2103 1658 Arpachshad, son of Shem, was born.
Yes.
Minus 2068 1693 Shalach, son of Arpachshad, born. Minus 2038 1723 Eber, son of Shalach, was born. Minus 2004 1757 Peleg, son of Eber, was born. Minus 1974 1787 Reu, son of Peleg, was born. Minus 1942 1819 Sirach, son of Reu, was born. Minus 1912 1849 Nacharai, son of Sirach, was born. Minus 1883 1878 Terah, son of Nacharai, was born. The forefathers. Secular year Jewish year event in history. Minus 1813 1948 Abraham, son of Terah, was born. Minus 1803 1958 Sarah, daughter of Haran, was born. Minus 1788 1973 Abraham married Sarah. Minus 1765 1996 dispersion from Babel after building the tower. Minus 1761 2000 Terah left Ur Kasdim with his family. Minus 1755 2006 Noah died. Minus 1743 2018 The covenant, Brit Bain Habitarim, with Abraham. Minus 1738 2023 Abraham settled in Canaan. Minus 1727 2034 Ishmael, son of Abraham, was born. Minus 1713 2048 Abraham circumcised himself and Ishmael. Minus 1713 2040 Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. Minus 1713 2048 Isaac, son of Abraham, was born. Minus 1677 2084 The Acta, where Isaac was brought on the altar by minus 1677 2084 Sarah died. Minus 1653 2108 Jacob and Esau were born. Minus 1638 2123 Abraham died. Minus 1603 2158 Shem, son of Noah, died. Minus 1592 2171 Isaac blessed Jacob instead of Esau. Minus 1576 2185 Jacob went to Haran. Minus 1574 2187 Eber, great-grandson of Shem, died. Minus 1569 2192 Jacob married Leah and Rachel. Minus 1566 2195 Levi, son of Jacob and Leah, was born. Minus 1562 2199 Joseph, son of Jacob and Rachel, was born. Minus 1556 2205 Jacob left Haran. Minus 1553 2208 Benjamin was born. Minus 1545 2216 Joseph was sold. Minus 1533 2228 Isaac died. Minus 1532 2229 Joseph became viceroy of Egypt. Minus 1526 2235 Kahat, son of Levi, was born. Minus 1523 2238 Jacob, and his family, went to Egypt. Living in Egypt. Secular year Jewish year event in history. Minus 1506 2255 Jacob died. Minus 1429 2332 after Levi died. The enslavement in Egypt began. Minus 1393 2368 Moses was born. Minus 1355 2406 Joshua was born. Minus 1314 2447 Moses encountered the burning bush. Minus 1313 2448 The Jewish nation left Egypt. Traveling through the desert. Secular year Jewish year event in history. Minus 1313 2448 The Jewish nation crossed the Red Sea. Minus 1313 2448 The revelation at Mount Sinai and the giving of the Torah. Minus 1313 2448 Moses broke the tablets. Minus 1312 2449 Moshe came down Mount Sinai with the second tablets. Minus 1312 2449 The tabernacle was erected. Minus 1312 2449 The spies returned from Canaan with bad news. Minus 1274 2487 Agaron and Miriam died. Minus 1273 2488 Moses died. Judges and early prophets. Secular year Jewish year event in history. Minus 1273 2488 the Jews crossed the Jordan into Canaan. Minus 1258 2503 the appointment of the land of Israel was completed. Minus 1245 2516 Joshua died. Minus 1228 2533 rule of judges began with Othniel ben Kenaz. Minus 1188 2573 Ehud ben Gera became leader. Minus 1107 2654 Shamgar ben Anath died. Minus 1107 2654 Deborah became leader. Minus 1067 2694 Gideon became leader. Minus 1027 2734 Abimelech, son of Gideon, became leader. Minus 1024 2737 Tola, son of Pua, became leader. Minus 1003 2758 Jair, the Jalidite, became leader. Minus 982 2779 Jephthah, Hagiladi, became leader. Minus 969 2792 Elon, Hazabilonai, became leader. Minus 959 2802 Abdon ben Hillel became leader. Minus 951 2810 Samson became leader. Minus 931 2830 Eli the Cohen became leader. Minus 907 2854 David was born. Minus 892 2871 Samuel became leader. Kings and the First Holy Temple. Secular year Jewish year event in history. Minus 879 2882 Saul was appointed king. Minus 877 2884 David became king of Judah in Hebron. Minus 869 2892 David became king of Israel in Jerusalem. Minus 837 2924 Solomon became king. Minus 833 2928 the building of the first Beit Hamikdash commenced. Minus 827 2935 the first Beit Hamikdash was completed. Minus 797 2964 Solomon died and his kingdom was divided. Minus 797 2964 Rehoboam, son of Solomon, became king of Judah. Minus 797 2964 Jeroboam ben Nebat became king over Israel. Minus 718 3043 Elijah went up in a chariot of fire. Minus 677 3084 Joash renovated the Beit Hamikdash. Minus 619 3142 Isaiah began his prophecies. Minus 574 3187 the first two of the 10 tribes were exiled. Minus 566 3195 another two of the 10 tribes were exiled. Minus 562 3199 Hezekiah became king of Judah. Minus 556 3205 the last of the 10 tribes were exiled. Minus 548 3213 Sennacherib invaded the land of Judah and retreated. Minus 533 3228 Manasseh, son of Hezekiah, became king of Judah. Minus 463 3298 Jeremiah began his prophecies. Minus 458 3303 Josiah renovated the Beit Hamikdash. Minus 442 3319 Jerusalem was conquered and Jehoiakim, was exiled. Minus 443 321 Jehoiakim burned the Book of Lamentations composed by Jeremiah. Minus 434 3327 Jerusalem was conquered again and Jehoiakim was exiled. Minus 433 331 Jeremiah persisted in prophesying calamity. Minus 429 3332 Ezekiel prophesied in exile. Minus 425 3336 the final Babylonian siege of Jerusalem. Minus 423 3338 the walls of Jerusalem were penetrated. Minus 423 3338 the sacrifices ceased in the Beit Hamikdash. Minus 423 3338 the first Beit Hamikdash was destroyed. Exile in Babylon. Secular year Jewish year event in history. Minus 423 3339 Gedaliah ben Achikam was killed. Minus 421 3340 Daniel interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Minus 410 3352 Ezekiel prophesied about the future Beit Hamikdash. Minus 372 3389 Daniel read the writing on the wall. Minus 372 3389 Daniel was thrown into the lion's den. Minus 371 3390 Zerubbabel led the return to the land of Israel. Minus 373 391 building of second Beit Hamikdash commenced. Then halted. Minus 366 3395 Akashverosh II made his great banquet. Minus 362 3399 Esther was taken to the palace. Minus 357 3404 Esther took action against Haman's decree. Minus 355 3,406 Mordecai proclaimed the celebration of Purim. Minus 353 3,408 building of the second Beit Hamikdash resumed. Minus 349 3,412 the second Beit Hamikdash was completed. Building of the second Holy Temple. Secular year Jewish year event in history. Minus 348 3,413 Ezra led the second return to the land of Israel. Minus 335 3,426 Nehemiah returned to rebuild walls of Jerusalem. Minus 313 3,448 Ezra died. Minus 313 3,448 Simon the Zodic met Alexander the Great. Minus 313 3,449 the Minyan Shtaro began. Greek cultural domination. Secular year Jewish year event in history. Minus 273 3,488 Simon the Zodic died. Minus 246 3,515 72 elders translated the Torah into Greek, Septuagint. Minus 143,621 the revolt of Mattatyahu the Shashmanai. Kingdom of Judea. Dynasty of the Shashmanaim. Secular year Jewish year event in history. Minus 139 3,622 Judah the Maccabee ruled. Minus 139 3,622 the second Beit Hamikdash was rededicated. Minus 138 3,623 Hanukkah was declared a festival. Minus 133 3,628 Judah the Maccabee was killed in battle. Minus 133 3,628 Yonatan, son of Mattatyahu, ruled. Minus 127 3,634 Shimon, son of Mattatyahu, ruled. Minus 119 3,642 Yohanan Harkanos, son of Shimon, ruled. Minus 93 3,668 Judah Aristobulus, son of Yochanan Harkanos, ruled. Minus 91 3,670 Alexander Yanai, son of Yochanan Harkanos, ruled. Minus 73 3,688 Queen Shalom Zion, Salome Alexandra, wife of Alexander Yanai, ruled. Minus 65 3,696 Aristobulus II, son of Alexander Yanai, ruled/td. Minus 61 3,700 the Romans gained control of Judea. Minus 61 3,700 Harkanos II, son of Alexander Yanai, ruled. Minus 43,721 Antigonus, son of Aristobulus II, ruled. Roman client kings and rulers, the Herodian dynasty. Secular year Jewish year event in history. Minus 36 3,725 Herod I ruled. Killing all the Shashmanaim. Minus 33 3,728 Hillel became the leader of the Torah scholars. Minus 19 3,742 Herod I began rebuilding the second Beit Hamikdash. Minus 11 3,750 renovation of the second Beit Hamikdash was completed. 1 3,761 Archelaus, son of Herod I, ruled. 8 3,768 Hillel died. 10 3,770 Archelaus was deposed by the Roman emperor. 21 3,781 Agrippa I, grandson of Herod I, ruled. 28 3,788 the Sanhedrin moved from the second Beit Hamikdash. 44 3,804 Agrippa II, son of Agrippa I, ruled. 53,810 Rabban Gamliel I, son of Shimon, grandson of Hillel, died. 66 3,826 Vespasian arrived in Judea to reassert Roman authority. 69 3,829 the second Beit Hamikdash was destroyed. The Talmudic era. The Mishnah. Secular year Jewish year event in history. 74 3,834 Ar Yohanan ben Zakkai died. 86 3,846 the Sanhedrin moved from place to place, under Ar Gamliel II. 133 3,893 Bader fell, and the Bar Kokhba revolt ended in tragedy. 134 3,894 Judaism was banned, and Ar Akiva was imprisoned. 189 3,949 Ar Judah Hadassi completed the Mishnah around this time. The Talmudic era. The Gemara. Secular year Jewish year event in history. 219 3,979 Rav left the land of Israel and settled in Babylonia. 247 4007 Shmuel was the Talmudic authority in Babylonia. 254 4014 Ar Yohanan was the leading Talmudic authority. 294 4050 Ar Huna was the leading Talmudic authority. 298 4058 Ar Yehuda was the leading Talmudic authority. 304 060 Ar Kista was the leading Talmudic authority. 309 4069 Rabba was the leading Talmudic authority. 321 4081 Ar Yosef was the leading Talmudic authority. 325 4085 Ababi was the leading Talmudic authority. 338 4098 Rabba was the leading Talmudic authority. 359 4119 Hillel II, who established the calendar, became Nasi. 392 4152 Ar Ashi was the leading Talmudic authority. 427 4187 Arashi died after the compilation of the Gemara. 475 4235 The Talmud was complete when Ravina II died. The Rabbanan. Secular year Jewish year event in history. 551 4311 Mar Zutra proclaimed Jewish self-rule in Babylonia. The Janim. Secular year Jewish year event in history. 589 4349 The Talmudic Academy of Pumbedita was reconstituted. 609 4369 The Talmudic Academy of Sura was reconstituted. 614 4374 The Persians conquered the land of Israel. 614 4374 The Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem. 629 4389 The Byzantine Empire reconquered the land of Israel. 636 4396 Aritzhak was the last Jayon of Nehardeh, Firashuver. 637 4397 The Arabs conquered the land of Israel. 645 4405 One of the Takanat Hajanim was enacted at this time. 755 4515 Arakeh Jayon left Iraq for the land of Israel. 759 4519 Ar Yehuda became Jayon of Surah. 759 4519 The Halachat Idalat, B.A. Hag, was written at this time. 788 4548 Another of the Takanat Hajanim was enacted at this time. 858 4618 Aramrum, who wrote the Siddur, became Jayon of Surah. 928 4688 Rabbi Anusayadiah was appointed Jayon of Surah. 955 4715 Four captives were ransomed at around this time. 968 4728 Ar became Jayon of Pumbedita. 997 4757 Arhai became, the last, Jayon of Pumbedita. 1038 4798 Arhai died. And the academies of Babylon declined. The early Rishonim, the Crusade massacres. Secular year Jewish year event in history. 1044,800 Rabbi Anujersim Mir Hagola died. 1088 4848 The river arrived in Spain from Morocco. 1096 4856 The Crusaders destroyed Jewish communities. 1099 4859 Jerusalem was captured by the Crusaders. 1103 4863 The Rip died. 1105 4865 Rashi died. And the era of the Tosafot began. 1135 4895 The Rambam, Maimonides, was born. 1144 4904 The first, recorded, blood libel took place. 1147 4907 The Crusaders attacked Jewish communities. 1147 4907 Rabbi Anutam was captured by the Crusaders. 1148 4908 The Rambams and the Radak's families left Cordova. 1165 4925 The Rambam visited the land of Israel. 1171 4931 Rabbi Anutam died. 1175 4935 The Rashbam died. 1184 4984 The young son of the Aras killed. 1187 4948 Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem. 1189 4949 Ar Yaakov d'Orleans was killed in London. 1194 950 Jews were massacred in England in the Third Crusade. 1191 4951 Rabbi David Kimchi, known as the Radak, wrote his commentary. 1194 4954 The Ramban, Nachmanides, was born. 1198 4959 The Arayavid died. 1204 4965 The Rambam died. 1236 4996 Rampaging mobs massacred Jews in France. 1242 5002 A massive burning of the Talmud took place in Paris. 1244 5004 Jerusalem was sacked by Egyptians and Turks. 1252 5012 The Inquisition began to use torture. 1267 5027 The Ramban left Spain and settled in the land of Israel. 1275 5030 The Ramban died. 1286 5046 The Maharam Mir Rothenberg was imprisoned. 1295 5050 New works advanced the study of Kabbalah. 1295 5050 The era of the Tosafot concluded at around this time. Later Rishonim. Persecutions and expulsions. Secular year Jewish year event in history. 1295 50 All Jews were expelled from England. 1293 5053 The Maharam Mir Rothenberg died in prison. 1298 5058 The Rheinfleisch massacres began. 1298 5058 The author of the Mordecai and Haggahat Maimoniyot were killed. 1305 5065 The Rashba placed a limited ban on philosophy. 1305 5065 The Rosh and his son, the Tur, arrived in Spain. 1306 5066 All Jews were expelled from France. 1310 5070 The Rashba died. 1325 5080 Jews were massacred by the Pasteros Crusaders. 1327 5088 The Rosh died. 1336 5096 Jews of Germany were massacred by the Armletter bands. 1338 5098 The Ralbag wrote his commentary on the Bible. 1349 5109 The Black Death massacres swept across Europe. 1367 5127 The Rab, Ribish, and other scholars in Spain were imprisoned. 1391 5151 Jews of Spain were massacred. Many were forced to convert. 1391 5151 The Ribish and Rashbats left Spain. 1394 5155 The final expulsion of Jews from France. 1413 5173 R. Yosef Albo was in a forced debate with Christians. 1421 5181 Jews in Austria were massacred in the Wiener Gezira. 1475 5235 The invention of printing was used for Jewish books. 1481 5241 The Inquisition was established in Spain. 1488 5248 R. Obadiah de Berdenoer settled in Jerusalem. 1491 5251 Columbus consulted R. Abraham Zacuto for his travels. 1492 5252 All Jews were expelled from Spain and Sicily. The great scholars of the Shulchan Aruch and Torah Consolidation. Secular year Jewish year event in history. 1493 5253 R. Itzhak Abarbanel arrived in Naples from Spain. 1496 5257 All Jews were expelled from Portugal. 1516 5276 The Ein Yaakov was printed. 1516 5276 The Turks, Ottoman Empire, conquered Eretz Yisrael. 1525 5285 R. Yosef Yasselman saved many Jews during the Peasants' War. 1553 5314 A mass burning of Jewish books took place in Rome. 1563 5323 The Shulchan Aruch was completed by R. Yosef Karo. 1575 330 The Shulchan Aruch was published with supplements of Rama. 1572 5332 The Arizal died in Ksvat. 1573 5333 The Maharal came to Prague. 1573 5334 The Maharshal died. 1575 5335 R. Yosef Karo died in Safat. 1599 5359 The Maharal returned to Prague again. 1614 5374 The Maharsha became rabbi in Lublin. 1616 5377 The Tosafot Yom Tov commentary was concluded. 1621 5382 The Shallow arrived in the land of Israel. 1629 5389 R. Yom Tov Lipman Heller was imprisoned in Prague. 1645 400 R. Yoel Sirks, the Bach, died. 1646 5406 The Shach and Taz, on Shulchan Aruch, were printed. 1648 5408 Jews were massacred by Shmuel Maki's forces. Early Akaranim and East European massacres. Secular year Jewish year event in history. 1654 5414 The first Jews settled in New Amsterdam, New York. 1655 5415 Many Jews killed in Russian and Swedish invasions of Poland. 1656 5416 Jews were permitted to live in England. 1656 5416 Baruch Spinoza was excommunicated. 1673 5433 The Magen Avraham, on Shulchan Aruch, was completed. 1676 5437 Shabtai Tzvi died as a Muslim. 1689 5449 The Beit Shmuel, on the Shulchan Aruch, was printed. 1698 5458 The Baal Shem Tov was born. 1702 5463 The Ni'ah Yahushua's family was killed in an explosion. 1712 5472 The Sittei Chachamim was arrested. 1724 5484 R. Yaakov Kulai, Miam Loizi, arrived in Constantinople. 1727 5487 The Mishnah Elimelech died. 1734 5494 Jews were massacred by the Haidamach bands. Akaranim and early Hasidim. Secular year Jewish year event in history. 1741 5501 Igor Hashayim arrived in the land of Israel. 1747 5507 Ar Moshe Haim Luzito, Runkle, died in Akko, Acre. 1755 510 Ar Jonathan Beskuds became rabbi in Hamburg. 1754 5515 Ar Yechezkel Landau, known as the Noda by Yehuda, became rabbi in Prague. 1757 5518 The Frankists instigated mass burnings of the Talmud. 1759 5519 Frankists supported blood libel charges in public debate. 1765 5520 The Baal Shem Tov died. 1764 5524 The Council of Four Lands, known as the Va'ad Arba Aritzot, was discontinued. 1768 5528 Despite resistance, the Haidamachs massacred thousands. 1772 5532 The Maggid of Mazuritz died. 1700 5542 Edler and Chatham Sofer visited the No Yehuda. 1786 5546 Ar Elimelech of Lizins died. 1791 5551 The Pale of Settlement was established in Russia. 1793 5553 Jews suffered in Reign of Terror of French Revolution. 1797 5558 The Vilna Gaon died. 1798 5559 The Bal Hadanya was released from first imprisonment. 1799 5559 Napoleon led an army expedition through the land of Israel. 1806 5566 The Judah, Ar Haim Yosef David Ajalai, died. 1806 5566 The Chatham Sofer became rabbi in Presburg. 1809 5570 Ar Levi Yitzhak of Berdichev died. 1810 5571 Ar Nachman of Breslov died. 1814 5574 Ar Akiva Eger became rabbi in Posen. 1814 5575 Koznitzer Maggid and Yehudi of Hashizka, both died. 1815 5575 Joseph of Lublin and Ar Mendel of Rimano both died. 1819 5579 Anti-Jewish riots spread throughout Germany. 1827 5587 Russia began conscripting Jewish children to the army. 1845 600 Ar. Yisrael of Ruzin was released from imprisonment. Later Akaranim and the Changing Society. Secular year Jewish year event in history. 1843 5603 The Tzemach Tzedek of Lubavitch was repeatedly arrested in Russia. 1846 5606 Sir Moshe Montefiore visited Russia to help local Jews. 1848 5609 Ar Yisrael Salander left Vilna. 1851 5611 Ar Shimshon Raphael Hirsch became 1859 5619 Ar Menachem Mendel of Kotsk died. 1864 5624 The Melvin was imprisoned, and then expelled from Romania. 1866 5626 Judashe Haram, Tiferet Shlomo, and Tzemach Tzedek died. 1873 5633 The Chafetz Haim was published. 1874 5634 The Minchat Chinuch died. 1878 5638 Petah Tikva agricultural settlement was established. 1881 5641 Many Jews began leaving Russia after a wave of pogroms. 1886 5646 Ar Shlomo Gans Fried, author of Keetzer Shulchan Aruch, died. 1892 5652 Ar Haim, Brisker, became rabbi in Brisk. 1905 5665 The Sfat Emet died. 1905 5665 Many Jews were killed in official Russian pogroms. 1911 5671 Chazanish was published. 1914 5674 Over 500,000 Jewish soldiers fought in World War I. 1918 5678 Over 60,000 Jews were killed during the Russian Revolution. 1923 5684 The Daf Hayomi study cycle commenced. 1927 5687 The 6th Lubavitcher Rebbe was released from Soviet prison. 1938 5699 Jews were attacked in the Kristallnacht pogroms in Germany. The Holocaust. Secular year Jewish year event in history. 1939 5699 Germany started World War II. and mass killing of Jews. 1941 5,701 Nazi Germany unexpectedly invaded Russia. 1941 5,701 200,000 Jews were killed at Babi Yar and Ponary. 1942 5,702 400,000 Jews of Warsaw were sent to death camps. 1943 5,703 Nazi Germany experienced massive losses in the Battle of Stalingrad. 1943 5,703 The remaining Jews in Warsaw staged a massive uprising. 1943 5,703 Jewish uprisings at Treblinka, Sobibor, and Bialystok. 1943 5,703 The Danish people quietly rescued 93% of their Jews to safety. 1944 5,704 300,000 Hungarian Jews were killed in 3 months. 1944 5,705 Uprising in Auschwitz death camp just before freedom. 1945 5,705 Nazi Germany was conquered. And World War II ended. 1945 5,705 6 million Jews were killed by the Nazis during the war. The modern state of Israel. Secular year Jewish year event in history. 1947 5,707 Publication of the Talmud Encyclopedia was commenced. 1947 5,708 The United Nations divided Israel. 1947 5,708 Arabs attacked Israel to gain territory. 1948 5,708 The State of Israel was established. 1948 5,708 Israel was invaded by many Arab countries. 1949 5,709 The War of Independence in Israel ended. 1950 5,710 All Jews left the ancient Jewish community of Iraq. 1950 5,710 Almost all Jews of Yemen emigrated to Israel. 1951 5,711 The Lubavitcher Rebbe accepts the mantle of leadership. 1956 5,717 Jewish forces invaded Egypt and conquered the Sinai Desert. 1967 5,727 The Lubavitcher Rebbe established the Tefillin campaign. 1967 5,727 Jerusalem reunited under Jewish rule in the Six-Day War. 1973 5,734 2,500 Jewish soldiers were killed in the Yom Kippur War. 1974 5,734 The Lubavitcher Rebbe established the Shabbat Candle campaign. 1982 5,742 massive enemy arsenals were discovered in Lebanon. 1987 5,746 The first international conference of Chabad Lubavitch emissaries. 1993 5,753 A secret agreement signed in Oslo. 1994 5,754 The Lubavitcher Rebbe passed away. 2008 5,767 Deadly terrorist attack at the Chabad house in Mumbai, India, kill 6. 2020 5,780 Israel signed Abraham Accords, normalizing relations with UAE and Bahrain, soon followed by Sudan and Morocco.
Well, that is it. 25.
I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. One of the most difficult aspects in starting to study Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah is getting a handle on just how those ideas developed over time. It's tempting to think that, for instance, Kabbalah has just always existed in the form that we have it, or that Kabbalah is just one thing at all. Of course, neither of these positions is really tenable. Such notions developed greatly through the ages and are still developing. And there are now, and there have always been, numerous mutually exclusive schools of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. This class is meant to serve as an introduction to Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah from the point of view of its complex development from the prophets of ancient Israel until the rise of modern Hasidism in the 18th century. Of course, this series isn't meant to be exhaustive by any means, but only should serve as a springboard for deeper study and reflection, and hopefully it will also enable you to situate developments in Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in their historical and cultural context, and hopefully embolden you to dive into the primary texts, which are admittedly as sublime as they are obscure. Let me express my gratitude to Congregation Tchia for allowing me to use these lectures to reach a larger audience here on Esoterica. If you want, you can find the entire series under the playlist Entering the Garden, an Introduction to Jewish Mysticism and Kabbalah. I'll be uploading them over the next few weeks, or if you find these episodes after autumn of 2021 and you want to watch the entire series, you can find them in that playlist. If you find this series on Kabbalah interesting, I'd hope you check out my other content on topics in esotericism, and perhaps consider supporting the production of free academic and scholarly topics in occultism, hermetic philosophy by joining my Patreon or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below, and I really appreciate your consideration. Now, let's enter the garden of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Welcome back. Let's just jump right in, right? So the first thing we should do is do a bit of a recap on apocalyptic Judaism, just so that we can all be on the same page going forward. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, apocalyptic Judaism really emerged in the turmoil of the period after the Babylonian conquest in 586 BCE, and then really taking its form in the period after the Judahites are allowed to return to their homeland beginning in 537 BCE. And it's in the subsequent aftermath of that turmoil that what we have is a big theological shift in how the ancient Israelites understood their relationship to their God. As you may remember, the older, more prophetic literature said that if the Israelites don't keep their part of the bargain, God's going to wipe them out. Well, they weren't all wiped out. And so that's a theological problem. We have a sort of a threat that, I remember my mom sometimes telling me, I brought you into this world and I'll take you out of it. And then I did something bad and she didn't take me out of it. And I'm like, I might have called your bluff, Mom. I don't recommend you do that. But, well, that kind of happened with the Israelites, right? God threatened, look, I brought you into this world, I'll take you out of it. And God didn't. So what do we do theologically with that? And what ends up happening and what ends up emerging is a new kind of theology and a new kind of interaction with the Israelite God. And so rather than the Israelite God communicating orally to prophets, what we have is a shift in the theology where rather than communicating orally, right, what we have is God communicating visually, right? God is showing the Israelites various kinds of things. And the biggest, perhaps the most important thing that God is showing to the Israelites is that there's a plan. That everything that's happening is planned. There is a reason why you're suffering the way that you're suffering. There's a reason why wicked people seem to triumph. There's a reason why you've been returned to your homeland after being conquered by the Babylonians. There's a reason why the Romans, you had independence for a while, and now the Romans have conquered you again. Why is all this happening? Well, for the apocalypticists, there is a plan. And typically, right, other things that the apocalyptic literature also deals in is things like cosmology, right, the structure of the universe, history, why the universe came into being at all, and specifically what they're often really interested in is the origin of evil. Why? Because they're enduring a lot of evil. And so they really focus on where evil came from and how evil emerged. And there's a lot of different competing theories in the ancient Israelite literature about the origins of evil. Some of those have to do with talking snakes in a special garden, and some of those have to do with angels coming down to mate with women and teaching human beings all kinds of bad things. But there are several competing theories about the origin of evil, and of course also apocalypticism is at least vaguely interested in the future, right? At least vaguely interested in the future. Not in the same way that perhaps we are now. If you're curious in religious studies, we have a whole different term for studying the future end of the world. That's called eschatology, from the Greek eschaton, which means the final things. But not all apocalypticism is eschatology, but all eschatology is probably apocalyptic, right? So those are slightly different categories. We'll talk more about eschatology later. And as I mentioned last time, there is a massive amount of apocalyptic literature. I think that if I skip back just a couple slides here, right, you can remember here on the page, there's just a library of apocalyptic literature that gets developed, some of which occurs in the Hebrew Bible, most of which does not, right? And then, of course, we also have Christian and Islamic apocalyptic literature. This is a vast amount of literature. And I think, as I mentioned, if you were to take the apocalyptic literature and compare it to the actual surviving literature of the Hebrew Bible, there's almost just as much apocalyptic literature as there is other material in the Hebrew Bible. So it is a treasure trove of material, most of which I think most people have never read before. Much of which was lost for a long period of time, actually. Of course, the most famous pieces of apocalyptic literature are the books of Daniel. Daniel 7 through 11 is sort of the locus classicus of the genre. It really sets the stage for the genre. But of course, also is the book of Enoch. Of course, the book of Enoch, as you may know, isn't actually one book. It's about 5 different books that are stitched together, and there's various kinds of Enochian stuff in there. And in addition to that, there isn't just one book of Enoch. There are actually 3, right? We have 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Enoch. So the Enoch literature alone, 1st Enoch, I think comprises almost 100 chapters. It is a massive book. So Enoch is a terribly large volume, and of course 2nd and 3rd Enoch are also part of that literature as well. So even the Enoch literature is itself really vast if you get down into reading it and studying it. And of course, the apocalyptic literature is marked by an intense use of symbolic visions, and it heavily features what we call ex eventu prophecy, which is where you describe a current situation in encoded language as if it's going to occur in the future. Now, this has led to a lot of confusion, right? Because when you read the book of Daniel, many people now read the book of Daniel as predicting the future, right? This is going to describe the coming war with Russia or China or something. But the reality is, it actually describes the Persians and the Romans. It describes what's going on in their time period. And so this has led to a lot of confusion. And in many ways, the entire Christian evangelical world has this intense idea that encoded in the Bible are the secrets about how the world's going to end. Well, the truth of the matter is that these writers are describing things happening in their own day, as if it's going to happen in the future. And so that's led to, again, an entire genre of theology, what is sometimes called end times theology or end times research, eschatological research. But the original message of that literature was not about the end of the world. It was about criticizing conditions on the ground. So you may, in some sense, think of some apocalyptic literature as having a kind of social justice bent, or being a kind of critical literature in the sense of social criticism, except for it's happening at a much different register. It's happening at a much different register than we might think of social criticism now. All right, so as I mentioned, right, this kind of literature, the apocalyptic mode of Judaism, would set the stage for a great deal of developments in Christianity and Islam. In fact, one might even describe Christianity as a form of apocalyptic Judaism that kind of got independent, right? It sort of got escape velocity and shot off Judaism. But other forms of apocalyptic Judaism existed as well. Organized forms of apocalyptic Judaism, perhaps second to the Christians, would be the Essenes. The Essenes were also an apocalyptic sect of Judaism, but they were probably wiped out during the Great Revolt. In fact, Josephus even describes how they marched out to battle and they were massacred in a couple different battles. So it didn't work out for them. Right, one of the things that's worth pointing out here is that apocalyptic Judaism did not prove popular in proto-rabbinic, and rabbinic circles. So we'll get to that. We'll get to why that is a bit more this evening, and how apocalyptic Judaism did survive into rabbinic Judaism and how it didn't. And again, part of what's going on here is the rabbis have a very simple agenda, folks. Their simple agenda is survival. Their job is to make Judaism work in the aftermath of the destruction of the temple, and in the aftermath of the genocide committed by the Romans after the Bar Kokhba rebellion. And so what the rabbis are concerned about isn't, right, this final battle with with evil. They're really concerned with how do you cook kosher food in an oven that has these characteristics. That's the kinds of things they're worried about. They're worried about continuity and not about theological clamoring over what's going to happen in some grand titanic battle. And so, because that, again, if you really do believe that God's going to intercede on your behalf in some grand titanic battle, well, you might march out, try to pick a fight with the Romans because God's on your side. Well, then you might get massacred. So the rabbis are less interested in those kinds of theologies, although with an exception we'll talk about tonight. And the reason why is they've seen them fail over and over again. You can imagine, right? After the 15th Messiah has come along and led a bunch of people into battle against the Romans and died, you can imagine that many of the people who are trying to keep the situation going are not impressed with that anymore, right? After the 5th failed Messiah, people are like, this Messiah stuff is just getting people killed. And by the way, it's still getting people killed. Right? You can talk to those folks out at Waco, you can talk to folks at Shringo, you can talk to a lot of folks. Messiahs often lead their people into great peril, and it can lead to all kinds of problems. By the way, Jesus wouldn't be the first nor the last Messiah. There have been a lot of Messiahs that come and go. And they typically share the same fate as Jesus, though they don't typically enjoy the same success that the Jesus movement did. So, the proto-rabbinical organizations, the proto-rabbinical movement was not very copacetic to the rise of the apocalyptic form of Judaism. So again, if you have questions, just make sure to put them over there in the chat, and I'll try to get to them toward the end of the lecture. So whether they're wrap-up questions or clarifying questions or digging deeper into whatever. So let's turn to a form of mysticism that did emerge from the apocalyptic mode of Judaism, but did survive in the rabbinical. It's going to be Merkabah mysticism, Merkabah chariot mysticism, and we'll clarify a bit more in a minute how weird it is, because of course it's going to be rather weird. As I mentioned earlier, and as the question was asked earlier, theophany, the idea that God appears to people, was a central Israelite religious trope. That's a sort of claim to fame and gave us a bunch of rules and shows us to be special. That's a core concept in Israelite religion and Judaism. This is an idea that survives all the way to this day, and one might even say that it's one of the core conceptions in Judaism as it is as it exists. So often, as I said, right, God would show up and God would reveal, sometimes through an intermediary, various kinds of information, various kinds of commands, or even God could even make contracts with various people. So God made contracts, for instance, with Abraham, right? Abraham said, or Abram at that time, right, you're going to do this and I'll do this and we'll make a deal, right? We'll make a break. We will covenant, as it literally says in Hebrew. And so God makes these various with these various people, or people in the case of the collective Israelite state. And so this idea that God can show up to you or show up to us was an idea that was very common in ancient Israelite worldview. Now, what's going to change, right? What's going to change is that visual contact with God typically is God coming to you, right? God revealing things to you. What's going to change in the apocalyptic mode of Judaism is that you're going to go to God. God's going to take you up into the heavens. An angel is going to escort you into the heavens and show you around the heavens, or show you around the cosmos, show you around the throne of God, show you the underworld even, right? Enoch even gets tours of the underworld, the bad place you don't want to go when you die. And so there's a shift in the apocalyptic. Rather than God showing you, right, you get to go to God. And that motion where rather than prophets being told things as if they're sort of passive recording it, rather than go on journeys, that's going to be one of the big shifts in the apocalyptic literature. And of course, the main two events in which this happens in the literature, and at least in the biblical literature, are Isaiah and Ezekiel. And those two theophanies, the theophany of Isaiah and Isaiah 6, and the theophany in Ezekiel, are going to be the two big prototypes for how this is going to go down. What I should also mention, by the way, is that the angels or the various other supernatural beings that are often seen by the apocalypticist or the prophet are not the angels that you're probably used to. I know most of you probably have in mind the more Renaissance version of the angel. That is to say, it's a roughly humanoid, sometimes even baby-looking creature with wings, right? Sometimes with multiple sets of wings, some 6 is typically the way it's described in Isaiah. In the Ezekiel vision, these beings look nothing like stereotypical angels. We have wheels covered in eyes that rotate around each other in weird ways. People have even said things that this may be a bow or something. There are other creatures that are sort of stiff-legged that have various kinds of wings and the shapes and the heads of various kinds of animals. They're very, very, very unusual creatures, and they often get strange names like the Chayot, right, the ones that are alive, or the Cherubim, or the Ophanim, that's the name of the wheel-shaped ones. So biblical angels or biblical supernatural creatures are very unlike the cherubic angels that you may have seen adorning paintings from the Renaissance. Israelite angels don't really appear like that. What's important about the apocalyptic is also what's going to be added from Isaiah and eventually into Enoch, where they're going to be given visions of the throne of God. They're going to be taken to the very apex of reality, which is God's throne room, and they're going to be shown images of the throne of God. Well, to get to the throne of God, you can't just kind of go, the old, what Maynard saying, right? You can't get there from here. Well, you can't. You got to travel, right? And the way that you travel typically is you travel up through the various spheres of the heavens, right? They're typically thought of as being 8 spheres of the heavens, and all of these spheres are inhabited by all kinds of supernatural creatures, angels and otherwise, demons in some cases. And you ascend through these spheres, right? And eventually you're given access to the palace where God lives, and you're given access to a vision of the throne of God. We first see this begin to happen in some of the literature associated with the character Enoch. Enoch, as you may know, is famous because Enoch never died. The Bible simply records that Enoch walked with God and God took Enoch away, right? So Enoch is one of the few people in the Hebrew Bible that is never said to die. Of course, Enoch along with Elijah are 2 characters that are said to never have died. Now, this will end up happening, right, is that the structure of the Israelite cosmos gets really thick. As you may remember from the first lecture, right, when I described the Israelite cosmos, what we have basically is a dome, right, and that dome is full of water, right, and it rains down, or hails down, or rains down, right, and God is above that dome. Well, what ends up happening is that after the Israelites come in contact with the Persians and the Greeks especially, and somewhat to some degree the Persians, they have a much more robust vision of how the cosmos works. So these are the guys that are going to invent things like astrology. And for them, what you have are various planets ascending, right, beginning with the moon and ascending all the way up to the planets, right? And so the universe gets much thicker. And of course, if those planets are moving around, right, they got to be moving through something. And what are they moving through? Well, there's a lot of debate about it. Aristotle thought it was crystalline spheres, but there's a lot of debate about what's going on. The most important point here is that the Israelites are going to inherit a quasi-Hellenistic, quasi-Persian worldview. When I say worldview, how they view the world. And the old Israelite conception of the universe gets a lot more complicated, right? A lot more complicated. So, right, what we have in the aftermath of some of this apocalyptic literature, specifically the Enoch literature, and if you ever want to read the Enoch literature, I can recommend a good translation for it. It's really fascinating literature. There's going to be a question here, right? We have the idea that Enoch ascended into the heavens and had visions of the throne of God. Well, curiously, the rabbis ask, can other people do this? Is it possible for someone else to make this ascent? And we're going to complicate that term ascent here in just a minute. And what's shocking is that the answer is yes. They say, yeah, you can go into the heavens and see the throne of God if you make this ascent through the various spheres of the heavens. And not just can you, but I've done it. And I can teach you how to do it too. And that's where we move out of the apocalyptic mode of Judaism, where the apocalyptic mode is simply revealing what Enoch experienced to a mystical practice whereby you, or at least some rabbis, could do this themselves. Notice that difference, right? One is literature, the other is mystical practice. And so the form of mysticism that begins to emerge in the Persian and in the Hellenistic period, right? This is beginning at the very earliest in the 5th century BCE, but certainly by the 3rd century, this is beginning to mature. And of course, by the second century, it's reached its second century of the Common Era. It's probably reaching its apex. We typically now refer to this literature, and many of the medieval Jewish folks did, and many folks in the Talmudic period do as well. They refer to this type of mysticism as Ma'aseh Merkavah, which typically we take this to mean something like doing of the chariot. Notice the word Ma'aseh in Hebrew has a sense of you doing something, right? You're not reading about it. You're not reading Enoch. You're trying to go on the same journey that Enoch did. The idea here is this is a practical form of spiritual journey. Now, this kind of literature is typically referred by two different names, but it always refers basically to the same kind of mysticism. In one form of mysticism, we refer to it as Merkabah literature. The word Merkabah is the Hebrew word meaning a chariot. And the reason why it's called chariot literature is because God's throne is typically imagined to be a kind of winged chariot. Now, if I scoot back a whole bunch of slides, right, all the way back to that Persian period coin, let me find the Persian period coin. Remember this coin I showed you guys a couple of weeks ago, right? Notice that this is probably Yahweh, right? Notice what Yahweh is riding upon. It's a chariot, right? And it has a wings, right? It's not being pulled by horses or whatever. It's a horseless chariot, right? God has a Tesla or whatever, right? So at any rate, God's being pulled on a chariot here, right? And this is a winged chariot. Notice this is also God's throne. So when we say Merkavah mysticism, what we mean here is that these mystics are attempting to go into the throne of God and have a vision of the divine chariot, which is also God's throne. It's kind of convenient that your throne is also a chariot because you can get around, I guess. The other name for this form of mysticism is Hechalot literature. Hechal in classical Hebrew is a temple, but it can also mean a palace. And so the Hechalot literature focuses on the journey, not the destination. All right, it's all about which one you want to focus on here: the destination, the throne of God, or the journey, the palaces of God. And what we get in this literature, this Hechalot literature, is very complicated descriptions of the various chambers or palaces that the mystic must go through in order to get to the throne of God. Because again, imagine that this is a king living in a kind of palace. Well, you just don't go into one room. God doesn't live in a one-bedroom efficiency in Brooklyn, right? God lives in the big, complicated palace, and you have to go from the outer layers of the palace to the inner, to the inner, to the inner, to the inner, and eventually you reach the innermost layer of the inner sanctum, where God's throne is. And so you have to pass through these various palaces. Now, that's not easy. And the reason why it's not easy is that these various palaces are occupied by all kinds of angelic beings who don't want you there. They do not want you there. You're not supposed to be there. This is a sacred, divine realm where human beings who are, sinful or whatever, shouldn't be hanging out here. And so what we get in the palace literature is that these very hostile, often military-like angels have various kinds of ways of making sure that you don't pass through the various palaces without very complicated passwords, without very complicated seals. These seals would be represented often by various kinds of divine names for these angels, and also you need to know the various names of the angels in order to address them properly. So you have to know their name, you have to know their seal, you have to know passcodes, you have to know all kinds of things in order to bypass these various kinds of angels. Some like secret codes almost. So you need to know that information, otherwise the angels will kill you. And in fact, there are even cases in some of the literature where the text will say, no, this is the wrong passcode. Like, this passcode is not the right passcode. This needs to be corrected because I went in there and I said that passcode. And they almost, there's a famous line in Hechalot Rabbi where one of the rabbis says, that angel almost shucked me like a piece of wheat. Right, so there's the idea that they can kill you. Of course, the ascent right through the palaces ultimately results in the vision vision of the divine throne, which is results often in a kind of ecstatic experience. These ecstatic experiences are often encoded in some of the poetry that gets written during the Merkabah literature. And what's even more fascinating is where it gets incredibly controversial, as you might imagine. You can sit on the divine throne. There's at least a couple of instances where people sit on the divine throne and they are transformed into angelic-like beings. This, in fact, happened to Enoch. Enoch was allowed to sit on the divine throne, and this transformed Enoch into a divine angelic being known as Metatron. And Metatron actually becomes the angel of the throne. Again, you can ask yourself, like, how can a lowly human being sit on the throne of God? Well, that's part of what makes this literature so. That's part of what makes this literature so shocking. Further, even more shocking, you can have a vision of the divine body. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, God doesn't have a body. One of the things that Judaism teaches is that God doesn't have a body. Well, kind of. God in this literature does have a body, and God's body can be measured. God's body can be measured. And typically this form of the subform of Merkabah literature is called Shiur Koma, which in Hebrew or Aramaic actually means something like the measurement of the body, or the measurement of the vastness, or the measurement of the heights. And so what happens in this literature is that you're given a glimpse of God, and you're allowed to measure the body of God and meditate on the dimensions of the divine body. So I'll show you an example of what that looks like in just a moment. So this form of mysticism is genuinely weird. What we have often are phenomenological reports, which is to say we have the mystics who actually give us a report of what they experienced. We have advice from other mystics actually telling other mystics how to do this and how not to do this. We have mystical advice entering into this, including some idea of the kind of techniques that they may have used in order to induce these visions. And there's also a great deal of literary flair. These documents are very well written. They are intentionally trying to be perhaps provocative. And what we get in these documents is a really fascinating glimpse into how they may have practiced this stuff. Also, it's worth pointing out at this point that for whatever reason, and there's still debate about this, for these mystics, for the Merkabah mystics, you don't ascend to the palaces of God. You descend, right? You're a day Merkabah. You descend to the chariot. Now, why they descend to the chariot, we don't know, right? It seems like you should go up, right? God lives beyond the stars, and up seems like, it's like Peter Pan, right? Second star on the right, straight on till morning, right? That you should go up toward the divine world. The Merkabah mystics never describe things going in that direction. You always descend into the chariot. Now, why that is, we don't know. I typically think that it might have to do with a kind of taboo that you don't describe the ascent because you're unworthy of ascent, but you may be able to descend. For instance, in the Hebrew Bible, sometimes the word barak, right, to bless, can also mean to curse if it's used in a euphemistic way. For instance, Job's wife tells Job to bless God and die. But what she really means is curse God and die. And if you read it in translation, it'll always say curse God because the word there is being used in a kind of unusual way. So that may be why, that you descend to the throne as opposed to ascending. But we don't know why they chose to describe it as a descent and not an ascent. Just to give you some idea of the main texts of the Hechalot or Merkabah literature, First Enoch is always described as is typically described as an apocalyptic piece of literature, but it heavily features into the Merkabah literature along with the visions of Isaiah and the visions of Ezekiel. Those become the groundwork for the kind of later, very Baroque visions that we'll get in the Merkabah literature. The two principal texts of this literature are the Hechalot Zutarti, and this is the lesser palaces. This is considered to be typically the older of the oldest form of the Merkabah literature. It's a relatively short text, and it has to do with the descent of Rabbi Akiva. We have the Hechalot Rabbati, which is the longest text of the Hechalot literature. This describes the descent of Rabbi Ishmael. Both of these rabbis lived in the 2nd century of the Common Era. Another text that was also very popular was what is called the Maaseh Merkavah, the account of the chariot. This is primarily ecstatic poetry uttered by the descenders when they made the descent, so it's largely Merkavah poetry. We also have the Sefer Echad, the Book of the Palaces. This is also known as Third Enoch, and this has to do with the transmutation of Enoch into the angel Metatron, with the whole sitting on the throne of God. What's also worth pointing out is that in Third Enoch, you have perhaps one of the most provocative ideas in all of Jewish mysticism, which is to say that not only is Enoch transformed into Metatron, but that Metatron is sometimes described here as the Yahweh Katan, the little Yahweh, right? So you have the Yahweh Gadol, which is God, and you have Yahweh Katan, the little God. Now, the idea that there can be two gods is going to prove to be very, very dangerous and heretical idea in Judaism, but this idea was in the air during the Merkabah mystics, and so even Merkabah mysticism at some level challenged straightforward ideas of monotheism, which we take to be so sacrosanct in Judaism, but at least in Third Enoch and some other texts, the idea of a completely unified monotheism is disruptive, right? It's disruptive. And there's some ideas that even the Trinity may have emerged as may have emerged in conversation with some of this idea that there is a greater God, a lower God, and things like that. So again, the basic assumptions you make about Judaism are disrupted by some of these mystical ideas. One of which is that there is a lesser Hashem, a lesser Yahweh. And that idea is, I think, very, very shocking for many. And again, also I mentioned this text, Shior Koma. And Shior Koma is a separate piece of literature in which, as I mentioned, right, describes the various dimensions of the divine body in a Persian unit called the Parasite. We'll talk more about that in just a minute, and I'll give you an example of what that looks like from the Shior Koma. This form of mysticism seems to have hit its apex right around the 2nd century, right around the 2nd century, sometime in the middle of the 2nd century, in the 150s, 160s. Now, why? We don't know. Why that time period? That's the direct aftermath, or right at the time period of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. As you may know, Rabbi Akiva was martyred during the Bar Kokhba rebellion. Rabbi Ishmael lived around the same time. Why then? Well, perhaps people were very desperate. People wanted to have, people felt very abandoned by God, and so these techniques for descending into the throne room of God allowed perhaps them to connect with God in a new way. It's not clear, but that's when the form of mysticism seems to have hit its apex, although it seems to have been practiced all the way into the Middle Ages. And there are Hechalot texts that are actually absorbed into Kabbalah. So Kabbalah will absorb a lot of these texts, and they will survive into this literature. Just FYI, we have about 50 manuscripts of this literature that have survived from antiquity, all dating back all the way back to the Cairo of Giza. So we have a lot of this literature, right? A lot of this, which again, typically, right, we take whatever survived, and that gives us some sense of how popular something was. 50 manuscripts is not nothing, right? No, they're not all complete, they're not all in great shape, but the fact that there are 50 of these manuscripts that have survived, some of which survived all the way from Palestine or Babylon. They were moved across North Africa. They absorbed into the European context. That shows you that this literature is being copied, it's being appreciated, it's being admired. But it's really fascinating. It's really fascinating to survive with so many manuscripts. We think that the way this literature was formed, and this is a going theory right now, most literature, by the way, should also mention is in Aramaic, not in Hebrew, which means that it was also being written in the vernacular of the time. This is literature not meant. This was literature meant to be read and wrote in the vernacular. What we think is that there are smaller phenomenological units. The phenomenology is a $4 word that means experience. Right? These people are having experiences. They're recording those experiences. Those experiences are what we call microforms. They're just very small snippets of discrete mystical experiences. And it seems like there are schools of mystics having these experiences. So I might go to the first heaven, you might go to the fourth heaven, right? I might go to the third one, you might go to the second chamber of the fourth heaven. Over time, what ends up happening is that all of these various microforms get stitched together in what we call macroforms, much longer documents. in which narrative sections are kind of stitched into these microforms to form these larger narrative structures. And at some point, this got systematized, and we can see the systematization process happening in some of these texts, where the various palaces are very systematically described as having various kinds of chambers, how many angels are there, and how many angels have been made about that. The writers of these texts are imagining a kind of powerful army existing in the sky or existing in the divine realm, and it mirrors very closely the Roman army, which, by the way, also helps us take some of this material, because, of course, the Romans only existed during a certain time period. So what we get are these microforms, right, which are probably the result of mystical experiences. Those are stitched together in schools of mysticism, and then those are filled out in a more literary way in the text that we have now, are those final literary forms in the form of the Hechelotzatarti or the ViralRabbi. So we're fairly confident. The leading scholars in the field of this material are fairly confident that this literature is downstream of actual mystical experiences held in various schools of mysticism that are produced in a literary way over the course, perhaps, of several centuries. And as I mentioned, what we have in this literature are accounts of heavenly journeys, or accounts of journeys through the divine realm. And in these texts, we have very complicated passcodes. So many of these passcodes are angelic names that we don't understand. They're very long strings of characters in the Hebrew alphabet. We don't know what these texts means, what these names mean. They don't look like typical angelic names. And so we have these angelic names, right? So you would descend into a palace. There'd be an angel guarding the door. You would address that angel by their name, and the fact that you knew that angelic name meant that they might let you into the room, and then you could pass to another level, right? And then you would encounter several other angels, and you have to know various kinds of secret codes, or it's like sort of like divine espionage or something. So you would need to know several secret codes, and eventually an enormous mass of literature developed of just code books of various angels, where they live in the divine realm, how to bypass them, what you might need to bring them, because you might not be enough to know their name. You might have to bring them things, or give them seals, or show them sort of various quasi-magical devices. But next week we'll be getting into Jewish magic, and we'll see some of these angelic seals and these angelic magical passcodes. And what you would do is you would bypass aspects of the divine, so almost always in a mystical vision, and downstream of that mystical vision there would be a poem written, right, describing what you saw. Most of this literature is section describing the structure of the divine world, codes and angelic names, and then these hymns have actually survived into the Orthodox liturgy. This is a Rosh Hashanah service or a Yom Kippur service, and there are survivals of hymns, these Merkavah hymns in there, and you might immediately know why, right? Because think about what's happening in Yom Kippur, right? You are literally at the gates of the divine palace, and your prayers are entering the gates of the divine palace, and it has a very Merkavah feel to it, if you frame it that way, which I think would be a cool way of framing one's Yom Kippur experience as kind of approaching the gates of the divine realm and kind of, being threatened, right? It's terrifying. God can judge you. God can kill you. God's just figuring out what's going to happen. So it has a very kind of Merkavah feel to it. I can pull some of those hymns up maybe next time. The most famous example of one of these hymns, one of the most famous examples of one of these stories that we have of the Merkavah mystics, is the account of the four that entered the Pardes. So Pardes, and this is actually where the name of this class comes from, right? Pardes means something like orchard. And what ends up happening is that we have this tale found for us in the Babylonian Talmud, and it's actually found in several other places earlier than the Babylonian Talmud. But typically the most famous version is found in Babylonian Talmud tractate Chagiga. There's a lot of strange things in tractate Chagiga. It's about the holidays, the Chagim, and it's found at section 14b. What we have here is an account of 4 different rabbis from the 2nd century going into what is called the Pardes. The Pardes is a kind of orchard outside of the temple, right, or outside of the palace. If you can imagine, it's like the garden of God. They go into the garden, and what ends up happening is that Akiva, Rabbi Akiva, who's a very famous, a typical hero in this form of mysticism, warns them that they're going to lose you. Right? They're going to see pure marble, but it's going to look like water. And when you see God. Now, for Isaiah, we know there is no there is no there is no and there is no so he said, oh yeah, doesn't even try to perform Jewish law. He knows he's condemned. He knows never get in fact, when it says that when he died, smoke Rose is great. It's great. So he already, as soon as it died. That was actually God. It's actually given lashes, and the phrase for the lashes is pulsating as a fire. Fire will actually go and become a form of Jewish death later on. Really, in the Middle Ages, it's a little later. To the tip of your fingers, right? And you standardized by measuring the can. Right. So we have the right, right, of God. We have in the Hebrew text translated out. Simple answer is no idea what these words mean. They're not Aramaic words. Now, what's important about that is that next week, in these acronomians words, they're going to be a set of homology figures, which are unusually long. Well, I taught a Jewish mysticism class in art college once. Great, because art students are weird. They're great. But one of the things that one of the students did was actually go into big strong. Get this really creepy looking. I'll have to dig up where the guy came up with. What he did was he compiled every one and tried to make it so that God, and God's eyes are really big, right? God's eyes are really big. And shockingly enough, right, have you ever seen the stereotypical picture of like a gray alien? He kind of looks like that, right? Alien people, conspiracy people, whatever. But it is weird. It is weird. So we have this. This text goes on for pages and pages and pages of this stuff, right? The mentions of God's body. Now, when this literature was published back in, we don't know exactly when it was published. When it begins to emerge, we find it into the Middle Ages. One of the probably people that's reading this and thinking to themselves, "This is terrible," is Maimonides. There's a great argument that the Guide to the Perplexed, if you've ever had the, what's the right word? The pleasure or the punishment of having to read the Guide to the Perplexed, right? Because it's just as likely to perplex you than help you. One of the things that's true about it is that one of the main theses of the Guide to the Perplexed is that God does not have a body. And that what Maimonides does for the vast majority of that book is spend time going through every single metaphor of God's body, God's hand, God's eyes, God's legs, God's hair, whatever. And Maimonides goes through every single time the Bible describes God as having a body and shows that it's not to be taken literally, it's to be taken metaphorically. It's possible, I think likely, Menachem Kellner has written a book about this, where Menachem Kellner argues that at least in part, the most important piece of Jewish philosophy ever written was written to combat Merkava mysticism and Shior Lama mysticism. Now that's high praise, right? There's no higher form of praise than parody or criticism. Because if people are criticizing you, that means that they're taking you seriously, at least at some level, they're paying attention to you. And it seems that Maimonides, at least in part, is writing the Guide to the Perplexed as an argument against this form of mysticism. Now, what's worth pointing out here, right? What's really worth pointing out here is that this form of mysticism lasted for hundreds of years. We'll talk about that more in a minute. Now, I want to mention one tiny last form of mysticism that represents a relatively small chunk of this form of mysticism, and this is called the Sartora mysticism. This is a distinct form of Merkabah mysticism, and in fact, it might not even be Merkabah mysticism at all. It may actually cross the line over into magic, but it's always recorded in Merkabah texts. So there'll be a Merkabah text, and then all of a sudden there'll be a chunk of text that doesn't quite read like a Merkabah text. In this literature, we typically refer to as the Sartora mysticism. Sartora mysticism is unlike the Merkabah mysticism, where you descend into the divine realm to learn various kinds of secrets. In the Sartora mysticism, you actually summon an angel, right? You summon an angel through quasi-mystical or magical means. The line there is rather blurry. And you summon that angel, and that angel is called the Sartora. Sartora means the prince of the Torah. And this special angel comes to you. So notice here again, we're doing something different. Rather than going to somewhere, we're bringing a being to us. And what ends up happening is that the Sartora comes to you, and the Sartora rapidly teaches you all kinds of rabbinical lore. Everything from rabbinical law all the way to various kinds of hidden secrets. So the mechanism by which you summon this angel are varied. There's a lot of different accounts of how to summon this angel, but this is a kind of invocation. And to many scholars, this looks a lot less like mysticism, because it's not about you having an experience, but it looks a lot more like magic. You summoning a being, and then they provide you something in the process of summoning them. Just like you might summon a demon to teach you something, here, of course, you're summoning an angel, and that angel does the job of rapidly teaching you all kinds of rabbinical lore. Now, what's important about that is that idea of using magic to learn things very rapidly is going to survive in the medieval period, and it's going to be an entire school of magic called the Notary Art School of Magic that's going to be just this. Now, you're not going to typically summon an angel to do it, but it's interesting that we already have a form of mystical, magical stuff going on by the time of the Merkabah literature, where you are, in fact, summoning an angel to learn rabbinical lore very rapidly. And if you've ever studied rabbinical lore, then you can appreciate the fact that people might want to, not have to study all day in order to learn it, because it's a lot. So this Sartora literature, as I said, right, crosses the line probably into Jewish magic. And that is what we're going to pick up next week. We're going to begin to pick up with the earliest layers of Jewish magic, what the ancient Israelites thought about magic, what the rabbis thought about magic, and then we're going to look at some of the magical techniques and devices that have entered into Judaism and have thrived all the way down to this day. It's worth pointing out here that the Merkabah or the Hechloth mysticism would be the dominant form of Jewish mysticism for the majority of Jewish history. For the majority of Jewish history. We think of the Kabbalah as being the dominant form of Jewish mysticism, but the Kabbalah is only about 800 years old. If you say, we think again sometime in the 13th century, that's only 800 years old. This form of mysticism has existed all the way back probably to the 2nd century, probably earlier, and it was still being practiced all the way to the Middle Ages, right? All the way up to the rise of the Kabbalah. In fact, the Kabbalah absorbed a lot of this mysticism in it. So if you really want to think about Jewish mysticism in terms of what got practiced the longest, Merkabah, Hechloth literature, was practiced far longer, at least at this point, than Kabbalah, right? Kabbalah came later, and was only lived for about 800 years. I'm not saying only 800 years, right? But still, 800 years, right? This literature survived at least for 1,000, perhaps. So it's only the next couple hundred years that Kabbalah will lap Merkabah mysticism, right? Will lap it. So if you want some suggested readings, I'm going to try to include some more suggested readings as I go on. These are some major texts about the Hechel literature and American literature. One of the texts I did not put on here that I'll put on here for next time is a really great study of the Sartora mysticism. It's a definitive study of the mysticism that again involves summoning the angel to teach you things very rapidly. The problem with the American literature is that it's all published through the academic publisher Brill, and it's very expensive. So you need to definitely whip out your library card and check it out from a library, like a university library. If you want to read some of this, although there are some older translations of ViralRabbi online, so if you really want to get into them, and I can include them, and I can include them later if you want me to jump out and grab a link, I'll put it in the chat. If you really want to read some of this American literature, but I've included some links here for various studies of both the literature itself, but also some studies of the entire form of mysticism. And so I can include a link to, I can jump out, just a moment, I'm going to do some questions and answers. I can jump out and grab a couple links to folks if you want to check out the Shiur Koma, the measurement of mysticism, or the Hechel Rabbi, the largest text of the Merkava tradition. So, now this week, right, we have a bridge, and that bridge is going to connect us to Jewish magic. We're going to talk about the connection between Jewish mysticism. We now have a bridge to Jewish magic, and Jewish magic is going to be a huge part of Jewish mysticism. In fact, when you talk about Kabbalah Ma'asit, right, Kabbalah Ma'asit is just basically Jewish magic, practical Kabbalah, the doing of Kabbalah. The practical Kabbalah is in fact just the code word at some level for Jewish magic. And it's to that topic that we will turn to on Wednesday, which is weirdly enough, like 3 days from now. We'll turn to that on Wednesday, and we'll pick up with Jewish magic. Welcome back, and thank you for joining me as I explore the garden that is Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Again, if you'd like to support my work of providing accessible, free, and scholarly content on topics like Kabbalah, alchemy, and the occult, along with magic, hermetic philosophy, consider supporting my work on Patreon, or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.
You fuck, go fuck.
צובק